Hello, hello, hello. So today we continue with our series about Carlos the Jackal, the terrorist slash freedom fighter slash dickhead slash whoever you want him to be, right? Because it depends on perspective. So today we're going to focus on the terrorist landscape of the 70s and 80s, the 1970s and 80s. The 1970s and 80s were decades marked by political unrest, the rise of radical ideologies, and an expanding global network of militant groups. During this period, Carlos the Jackal, or Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez, became a prominent figure in international terrorism. His operations, often involving violent acts of political protest, transformed him into a symbol of revolutionary violence, but also a figure deeply intertwined with the geopolitical currents of the Cold War. This chapter will examine Carlos's role in the terrorist landscapes, the various networks he aligned with, and how his actions reflected broader trends in radical political movements. So, yes, international terrorism. What is terrorism? It's like, you can say this guy's a terrorist, and according to me he was, but some people will argue that, like, let's say the CIA would also be terrorists because of, let's say, the Sandinista movement which they supported, which was like a very cruel movement. And also, like, the CIA supported the Taliban, I think, during the same time, like in the early 80s. So, yeah, what is a terrorist, right? The backdrop of Carlos the Jackal's rise in the 1970s was a world divided by Cold War tensions. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a struggle for global supremacy, both militarily and ideologically. The conflict between these two superpowers also spurred numerous proxy wars around the world, especially in regions such as the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. For radicals like Carlos, the Cold War presented a perfect environment for violent insurgency. So, yeah, it's like unfortunate that Africa, like South America, Central America, Southeast Asia, that these places were embroiled in it. But, you know, like, as I said in a different episode, like, because of MAD, mutually assured destruction, the Soviet Union and the United States could never have a war. You know, you couldn't, like, the Soviet Union couldn't just, like, send boats across and, like, attack Alaska or Hawaii, and, like, the United States couldn't just, like, you know, do a naval landing or something in St. Petersburg. It wasn't possible, which is maybe a good thing. A lot of people are, like, super triggered about the fact that there's nuclear weapons, and maybe they should be, but the fact is, because of these super dangerous nuclear weapons, the rational actors who are in control of them, and they are rational, they don't use them for very good reasons. The only place I'm concerned about, to be honest, is Pakistan, because Pakistan has some hallmarks of a failed state. You would say North Korea, but, like, the thing about North Korea is it's just this one family, which is basically like royalty, Kim Jong-un's family, and they are in relatively good control of their weapons. Like, Pakistan seems unstable. Like, there's a lot of riots. There's, like, a lot of hunger, like social economic disparities. And I would be personally more concerned about Pakistan than I would be about North Korea. But I am not concerned. I worry about 200 things or 400 things before I worry about a nuclear war. It doesn't, like, I just don't think it's possible. Although it's possible, but the probability is so small, it's negligible. Carlos was not alone in his pursuit of revolutionary violence. Around the world, various leftist anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist movements emerged, many of which took inspiration from the Soviet Union's revolutionary rhetoric. These movements were particularly visible in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa, where they often saw themselves as fighting against Western imperialism and capitalist oppression. The Palestinian Liberalization Organization, or PLO, and Red Army faction, RAF, in Germany, and various Marxist guerrilla groups in Latin America were just a few examples of organizations that used violence as a means to achieve political ends. So, yeah, you had like all of these. So the Taliban was like a big one, and FARC like was a pretty big one, FARC in Colombia. Like, and yeah, you can't say like the Vietnamese were terrorists, the North Vietnamese, because that was like more of a guerrilla war, and it was like less terror. Like, but the RAF and the PLO did use terror. Okay, yes, I understand why they were pushed into a corner. Maybe not the RAF. You know, I can understand the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but the RAF, Red Army faction, these people were from like Champagne socialists or Champagne Marxists from Western Germany. Like they were just confused, like basically hippies or something, who turned to violence. And yeah, it's quite interesting. They went underground and they never like emerged, and they aged and stuff, and they became old and they ran out of money. So they got arrested, I think, after robbing a bank to get more money. Because I saw a movie about them called the Bader-Meinhof Complex, and yeah, like they ran out of money, they had to rob a bank, and then they got caught. And it was like all these old people. And yeah, it was like a very cliquey type of thing. Whereas, like, let's say FARC was a massive organization, much more organized. Although, yeah, I don't think you can call FARC super terrorists, like more also insurgency. There's a difference between like insurgency fighters and these like terror organizations. Insurgency fighters are also less likely. They can employ terror, but they're less likely to employ terror. They would be more interested, for example, in destroying a army base and taking their weapons. Carlos's radicalization was informed by these global movements. His alliance with the Palestinian cause was particularly significant, as it helped propel him into the international spotlight. His terror operations included bombings, assassinations, and high-profile hijackings, which were designed to strike at the heart of the Western world's political and economic systems, while simultaneously aligning himself with broader anti-imperialist struggles. So, yes, it seems to be a method to the madness. Like, if you like terrorize people enough, they may tell their governments, like, look, okay, let's strike an agreement with the RAF, for example. Let's like create sanctions against Israel, or like let's redistribute the wealth in Western Germany, something like that. That was the idea. Look, the government was never going to, like the German government was never going to fall for something like that. Like, you're talking about a massive government and a massive army and police force facing off against 30 terrorists. It's a one-way game. The PLO was different. Like, the PLO had a substantial presence. Like, they had a lot of people. And yeah, a lot of, at this time, the 70s and the 80s, well, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the West did wield a disproportionate amount of power. Okay, the Soviet Union as well. But, like, for example, with the Monroe Doctrine, like the USA just kind of did what they wanted to South America. And both the Americans and the Soviet Union interfered a lot in Africa. Like they destabilized a lot of African governments. The intersection of terrorism and revolutionary ideology. Carlos's embrace of violence was not merely an act of mindless rage. It was rooted in deeply held belief that revolutionary violence was necessary to dismantle the existing capitalist order. His radicalization was fueled by Marxist-Leninist ideology, which posited that the world's imperialist powers, particularly the United States, were exploiting the oppressed masses. According to this worldview, armed struggle was the only way to bring about real political change. This is like a common theme. Like, so your Marxists and these groups also exist on a spectrum. You get people who are very law-abiding, and then you get, well, the others. I know, for example, if like those of you saw the movie about Che Guevara with Benicio del Toro as the role, like they did try to establish connections with the Bolivian Communist Party, but the Bolivian Communist Party was very straightforward with them. They told them, we are not interested in violence, we cannot beat this government. So we're going to negotiate with them, and they said they were willing to negotiate back. So, like, you can achieve your, like, you can achieve certain things, but if you go against the Soviet Union or the United States, you're bound to lose. Like, unless you're like, let's say, the Taliban or, you know, the Vietnamese, who's like, well, they're not even they're not terrorists. We said so. Like, they are like, you know, rebels or like freedom fighters. Like, a revolutionary is more like someone who's active before a revolution has happened. And then the revolution happens, and then this person becomes a cadre or something like that. So that is like the massive difference. And a lot of these like organizations, the larger ones, they would use like these smaller organizations to an extent, but they didn't fully trust them because they were so small, they were so like, you know, militant, that like you don't want to be too much associated with something that's that trigger happy. Carlos's involvement in the Palestinian cause can be seen as part of the broader global struggle against imperialism. For Carlos and his associates, the Palestinian people were not only fighting for their own national liberation, but were also emblematic of the broader struggle against the West. The PLO, which had gained international recognition as the representative of the Palestinian people, became a key ally for Carlos. His relationship with the group and its military wing, the PFLP, was based on a shared ideological commitment to revolutionary violence. Oh, okay, so the PFLP is the PLO's, like, military wing. I didn't know that. Like, I learned something today. Okay, that makes sense. Like, yeah, and that will give the PLO also more legitimacy. Like the ANC in South Africa, you had the African National Congress, and then you had Umkhonto we Sizwe, which was the military wing. So, yeah, I understand this now. And what you had something similar in Ireland as well. I've got the names now. Carlos's commitment to revolution and the use of force to achieve it was evident in his many actions. These included hijacking commercial planes, bombing civilian targets, and even participating in military operations in Lebanon and Sudan. For Carlos, these operations were not just acts of terrorism, they were tactical maneuvers in the larger global revolutionary struggle. So yeah, like Marxists always have this idea that the globe has to be set free, and the revolution is only done once the entire globe is, well, under their specific version of Marxism. Like, it's a bit similar to these jihadis. Like, the jihadis believe that the struggle is only over once, like, they have taken over the entire world, which is kind of crazy, because how will you get people in Mexico to convert to Islam? All of them. Like, how will you get people in Norway to all become Marxist? It's like, it's not going to work. Like, I said it before, like, certain political systems aren't meant for certain cultures. Marxism comes from Germany. Like, neoliberalism comes from the United States. Like, Chicago. So how can these things just apply everywhere? It's one thing to, like, have, let's say, the technology of a cell phone, or the technology, let's say, a surgical procedure of how to remove a heart and put in a new one. To share this knowledge and to practically implement it is one thing. But a form of power, like an ideology, that's something different, because now you're like tinkering with people's cultures. Carlos's role in key terrorist events. Carlos's most famous operations were carefully calculated to achieve maximum political impact. One of his most notable early operations was the 1975 OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Energy Exporting Countries, Summit hostage crisis. In this operation, Carlos and his team of militants stormed the OPEC conference in Vienna, taking 60 hostages, including several oil ministers. Their demands were simple: the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, and a promise to halt the global oil embargo. The operation made global headlines, and Carlos's ruthless efficiency and media savvy ensured that his name was now known worldwide. Why did they want to stop the global oil embargo? I know in the 70s, like, there was an embargo against the West for supporting Israel. It was pretty serious. Like, that's why for a very long time you couldn't get Coca-Cola in the Middle East, because it was this symbol of America, and the Arabs were not cool with that. So, like, they drank Pepsi instead. But yeah, the Arabs had this long thing. Well, not the Arabs. Like, I mean, the Arabs is like a very big, the oil countries, like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the UAE and whatever. Like, Iran maybe, like Iran after the Shah, like, they used oil as a weapon very effectively, like, to basically change, like, to change policy. Carlos's influence stretched far beyond his actions in Europe. He also orchestrated terror attacks in Africa and the Middle East. His cooperation with other organizations, including Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Abu Nidal organization, was pivotal in his rise. These alliances extended Carlos's influence in the global terrorist network, making him a key figure not just for the PFLP, but also in the broader anti-Western insurgencies. This is like a wunderkind kind of person, in the sense that you are used, like, by so many organizations. So mostly by the PFLP, which is very interesting in the sense that you would think that an organization would only stick with, especially if it's a freedom organization and there's like a real, like, danger of being undermined from within. You would kind of think that they would stick with their own kind. Like, no, they welcomed Carlos the Jackal. So maybe the PFLP was very open-minded or desperate for needs of troops, or Carlos the Jackal was super like charismatic and he manipulated the PFLP to take him on. Carlos's ability to operate across national borders and collaborate with various international actors made him one of the most sought after and dangerous figures in terrorism. His activities were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger movement of radicalized individuals and organizations seeking to challenge the global order, especially Western hegemony. His ability to move seamlessly between countries and to gain support from state sponsors of terrorism was critical to his success. Yeah, so in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, like those of you who've watched the movies and stuff, like it was so easy to like forge a ID document. You just like scratch off the photo and then put a new one there. These days it's impossible. Like they watch they have fingerprint scanners and all of these things. It's like you have to be I think only governments can probably do it. Like this Mission Impossible stuff nonsense. Like I think only governments can pull off like this massive like infiltration. I don't think even just a normal bank, the bank security is very high. Like you have to, the way they do their data is like, or their security systems is very good. But in the 60s and 70s, it was not. Terrorism as a political tool. Carlos's strategic use of violence. What distinguished Carlos from many other terrorists was his understanding of the role of violence in the larger political struggle. For Carlos, terrorism was not an end in itself. It was a means to achieve a larger objective. Whether it was to secure political leverage, gain international attention, or advance a revolutionary cause, Carlos saw his actions as a part of a larger strategy. The mindset was reflected in the careful planning that went into each of his operations. Carlos's expertise in the art of terrorism lay in his abilities to blend ideology with pragmatism. His early operations, such as the 1975 OPEC summit raid, were meant to achieve both symbolic and tangible political objectives. The global attention they garnered was not only a victory for the Palestinian cause, but also for Carlos personally, as it solidified his status as an international revolutionary hero. His calculated use of violence, whether through hijacking planes, bombing civilian targets, or assassinating high-profile individuals, was always aimed at destabilizing the political status quo and advancing his political agenda. In his mind, every act of terror was a direct assault on imperialist powers and their capitalist structures. Carlos saw himself as an agent of change, a soldier in the global struggle for justice. While many would later view his actions as mindless violence, Carlos and his followers believed they were part of a justified revolutionary cause. So yeah, like you often hear this, like if you speak to like if the media because the media is always interested in many things, especially terrorists, or just terrorism would be one of the interests of the media. And when they talk to them, it's a universal excuse / explanation that because violence is visited upon their people, or like their constituents and so on and so forth, they feel that violence is the only answer. So, like, I don't believe in violence. I think it's totally unnecessary. There's better ways of, like, applying power. But I can understand that, like, let's say, if it was like Palestine, how, because like I think by the 70s and 80s, these Arabic republics, these Jumhuriyas were kind of defeated. I think like many of them lost wars against Israel, and like it was kind of clear Israel was in the driver's seat. And by that time, Israel also had extensive backing from the US. Israel didn't have backing from the US since day one, by the way. Like, initially people were against this new state. They were like, why do we need this? Like, it will annoy the Arabs. Because remember, the Arabs were allies during World War One for the British. Like, those of you who saw Lawrence of Arabia, good, nice movie, would know. Like, basically, the Arabs were like pretty good allies in getting rid of this like Ottoman Empire. So yeah, when Israel was started, it didn't have universal like support, and well, they terrorized the Palestinians like by, you know, it's one thing if you just took over Palestine and you told the Palestinians, look, we are claiming this land. You're welcome to stay in your homes, but you're going to get some neighbors. We're going to build these huge apartment blocks like on the edges of your farmland for new Jewish settlers, like make peace with it. If they did something like that, probably it would have been less bad. But they just like, they chased the Palestinians into these stuns, you know, kind of republics, and they drove them over the border into the neighboring countries, destabilizing those countries also, by the way. And then you can understand that these people are angry. It's not difficult to understand, although I'm still anti-violence. One of the most intriguing aspects of Carlos's career as a terrorist was his ability to secure support from state actors. While he was deeply involved in radical organizations such as the PFLP and the Abu Nidal organization, Carlos also maintained relationships with several governments that had an interest in stabilizing the West. The most prominent of these was Libya under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi's regime was known for supporting revolutionary movements around the world, particularly those that opposed US influence in Middle East and Africa. Carlos was one of the many individuals and groups who received support from Libya during this time. This connection provided Carlos with significant financial backing, as well as access to military training and weapons. Libya's involvement in international terrorism became one of the central elements of Carlos's operations, and it allowed him to carry out missions that were more sophisticated and far-reaching than many of his contemporaries. So yeah, like Muammar Gaddafi was kind of the Warren Buffett or the Elon Musk of terrorism. If this guy is behind you, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of resources, because Gaddafi can just go to speak to the Soviet Union and get anything he wants and then redistribute it. Like the Soviet Union would have been more circumspect. Like they would be like, okay, what can we get from Israel? You know, like maybe we should be neutral in this thing. Not always, but like, you know, you couldn't just get something from the Soviet Union. It was like, you know, the Soviet Union is like in many ways the same as the United States. It's just a super massive country that interferes in other people's affairs. But they are also like hypocrites in the sense that like the ideology that they espouse, they don't allow everyone who wants it to have it. Whereas Muammar Gaddafi would just like help you. Like I'll do a video about him. Muammar Gaddafi helped a lot of people. He like provided a lot of services. In addition to Libya, Carlos had also connections with the Soviet Union and various Eastern Bloc countries, which provided both ideological and material support. The Soviet Union's interest in supporting anti-imperialist movements around the world dovetailed, I love that word, with Carlos's own radical beliefs, and this made him a useful ally in the global struggle against Western influence. The USSR sponsorship of Carlos's activities was indicative of the broader political dynamics at play during the Cold War. where both superpowers sought to gain influence by supporting proxy wars and revolutionary movements. Carlos's connections to the world of drugs and criminal networks. While Carlos's political motives were clear, his operations were not only limited to ideological pursuits alone. There was also significant criminal elements to his activities. His involvement with various criminal networks, particularly those involved in drug trafficking and money laundering, has been widely speculated upon. Carlos's ability to fund his operations and maintain his lifestyle was undoubtedly aided by his connections to organized crime. Yeah, you see, so maybe Gaddafi didn't give him enough money, so he turned to crime. In particular, his ties to international arms dealers, smugglers, and drug cartels gave him the financial resources he needed to carry out large-scale operations. The exact nature of these connections remain unclear, but there is evidence to suggest that Carlos was involved in illicit activities that allowed him to sustain his terrorist campaigns. Whether directly through involvement in drug trafficking or via his connections to various criminal organizations, Carlos was able to maintain the logistical support necessary for his global organized operations. There was this thing I watched, I forgot the name. It was like this documentary, I think it was called The Octopus or something, but the octopus was insane. It's like this, how did it start out? It was this one guy who wrote like a software program for the American government, and he was screwed over. They didn't want to pay him. And then when journalists started digging, they found out that this is some insane thing, like that looked like an octopus, in the sense that it had 8 various branches, and I believe Carlos the Jackal was one of them. So you see, these dodgy people usually work with one another. Like you and I were, I assume everyone watching this is like law-abiding citizens, but you and I were law-abiding citizens. We will work within the law, and let's say we don't like each other, we just avoid each other, and we will deal with each other via other channels. Let's say you ate my guts, but I have the supermarket, I own a supermarket. You will still, if your house is next door, you will still come to my supermarket and buy there because it's right next door, and I will have to be polite to you because you're my client. If I'm a dickhead, other clients will notice and they will boycott me. So normal people, that's how normal people operate. But quite often these dirty actors, people like Carlos the Jackal, like the CIA, like KGB, what they would do is now and then they would actually work together, in very strange coincidences, but sometimes some things that are nasty needs to be done, and then they are the people who do it. And it is not let's say you want to support a certain group of people for some specific reason. Then if Carlos the Jackal is the guy able to do it, if let's say you don't want to be seen, if you're scared that let's say one of your KGB agents get caught and thereby exposing the KGB, you'd rather go through this third party or this intermediary person to keep your hands clean. And then I guess this is where Carlos became very useful, and hence he's this well-known international persona, because this is our man. This is the guy who can solve any problem. Conclusion: a global terrorist in a changing world. Carlos the Jackal was a product of his time, an individual shaped by both global political currents and personal psychological factors. His rise in the 1970s and 80s was a direct result of his ability to tap into the prevailing currents of radical leftist ideology and use of violence as a means of achieving political ends. His achievement in international terrorism, his strategic use of violence, and his ability to secure state sponsorship made him a formidable figure in global terrorism. Carlos's actions, while driven by a revolutionary ideology, also reflected the changing nature of terrorism in the 20th century. He was part of a new wave of terrorists who operated in a globalized world, where state boundaries were no longer a barrier to radical action. His role in the international terrorist landscape made him a central figure in the global struggle for political power, a struggle that would continue to evolve through the decades to come. In the next chapter, we will delve into Carlos's most infamous operations, examining the methods and impact of his terrorist acts, and how they contributed to his global notoriety. So, yeah, I can see how this works. Like, if you, with the advent of like the aircraft, like planes, like transcontinental, like aircraft, like plane travel routes, like airline routes, with the advent of like cheap telecommunications, that you can phone someone from London, like make a simple call from London to New York, the advent of television, like newspapers becoming very cheap and common, radio being super easy to set up and to run. Now, these things, it's no longer the same terrorism as you had, like, let's say, what was that? Yeah, the Black Ant, that Serbian organization in the, when was it, like the 1910s or something, that shot like Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, and then started World War I. That's an interesting story, by the way. Like, apparently, the only reason the Archduke was shot was that there was like some problem and he had to take a detour, and then like by accident, like this Franz Ferdinand, like, sorry, what was his name? Gavrilo Princip, like, by accident, Gavrilo Princip ran into the, or spotted the vehicle of Franz Ferdinand and shot him. So you see, well, like that in the 60s and 70s, like the thing was like much more advanced than that. Like now you have technology where you can like figure out like how someone will travel, like you can hide much better, you can coordinate your attacks much better, you can procure like your bombs and whatever you need much better. Okay, these days, like, you know, in the 2020s, it's even more crazy. Although a lot of people are skeptical about this 1984 thing, like, oh, the world's like 1984 now. I know, why? Are you a pedophile? Are you a terrorist? If you're none of the, or an arms smuggler, that's even, yeah, that's pretty bad. Like, if you're not these things, why are you scared? You know, like, of the government watching you? Unless it's like a Nazi government, I guess, but like, you know, or North Korean government. But if, like, you're in any other state, like, you're kind of a nobody. You know, if you're not Bill Clinton, sorry, like, what's that guy from Windows? Bill Gates. If you're not Bill Gates or George Soros or Elon Musk or Jack Ma, or Ricardo Slim, if you're not one of those guys, like, the government will generally find you uninteresting, or, you know, you have to be a person of interest. Like, basically, if they even look at this video of mine that I'm making, like, it will be so boring for them, like, that they will basically just, you know, ignore me and probably never look at me again. There's 8 billion people on Earth. You know, like, do you really think that the government's going to, like, with 1984, there's this idea that there's a camera in the corner that's spying on you constantly. looking at you when you're taking off your underwear or whatever, that's nonsense. Like, that's not how it works. That's, by the way, one of the reasons the Americans lost the spy war during the Cold War. So the Cold War, the Americans won, but the spying part, they lost. And it's because they used electronics. They used electronic surveillance as opposed to the Soviet Union, which had way less money. And therefore, the Soviet Union used human intelligence. And the human intelligence was much more accurate and much more reliable than the electronic surveillance. The electronic surveillance, like the amount, and I mean, this was like, the 80s, the amount of like electronic surveillance that came in overwhelmed the Americans. Now you can imagine it's even worse. Like, there's so much, they have so much data. I mean, this video I'm making now, I don't know how long it is going to be, like an hour maybe. If it's an hour, it's going to be 15 gigabytes, okay, which I'll compress. But like, that's a lot of data, to go through. And like, unless there's quantum computing or something, God knows what will happen. Then maybe with quantum computing, you can figure out what someone is up to. But even then, even if they do get quantum computing to go and with super hectic AI to go through all of this data, there's going to be such weird anomalies in the system, like someone who looks like a terrorist that isn't a terrorist at all. This Cambridge Analytica, like, at one stage, you could like open your Facebook to Cambridge Analytica and they would tell you your personality on the Myers-Briggs scale. And I was curious, so I did it. And like, according to Cambridge Analytica, I forgot what result it gave me, but it was totally wrong. Like, my result, according to Cambridge Analytica, the person I was most like was Kim Kardashian, like personality-wise. And I was like, really? No, it's like, I'm an ENFP. She was something totally different. And I was just like, is this what you're scared of? Like, this thing's broken. It doesn't even work. So, like, in any case, like, so Carlos the Jackal was like successful before these things like came into being, and slipping around intelligence forces and police forces, like, and the army intelligence was much easier for him. But anyway, okay, next up we will look at his role in international terrorism. Thank you very much and goodbye.